While many leaders are remembered in history books, Ada Deer's name is left out, even though her actions changed the course of history for Native people. When the United States government terminated the Menominee Tribe's federal status in 1954, Ada Deer stood up. She wasn't a politician or a celebrity, just a determined woman who refused to let her people be erased. Through years of relentless advocacy, Deer led the movement to restore the rights and sovereignty of the Menominee. Her efforts succeeded in 1973 and paved the way for other tribes to reclaim their identities. Ada Deer is an unsung hero whose legacy reminds us that true leadership means taking responsibility when others will not. As a textbook representative, I'm excited about our new history textbook, U.S. History. Think, question, discover. It encourages students to uncover the honest truth about the past. Today, we'll focus on a chapter about Menominee tribal member Ada Deer and the rights and responsibilities surrounding tribal termination and restoration. This isn't just her story, it's an American story. Native American history is often missing from school curriculum. As the American Historical Association notes, as of 2024, 18 states have passed legislation requiring public schools to incorporate Native American history into their secondary curriculum. Yet many state standards and textbooks confine coverage of Native people to a handful of topics, often clustered in the colonial period. This textbook invites students to explore essential questions like, how can restoring the rights to one group, like the Menominee Tribe, help protect the rights of others? And who's responsible for protecting those rights? Let's take a look. Beginning in 1817, the Menominee Tribe signed several treaties with the U.S. government, giving up land in exchange for much-needed resources required for the white-dominated country. Students will uncover on page 86 of our textbook that the Menominee territory shrank from 9.5 million acres to a 250,000-acre permanent reservation. As a result, the Menominee lost vital resources and faced continued poverty and exploitation. The Indian Reorganization Act was passed. The act aimed to dissolve assimilation efforts and federally recognize tribes as sovereign. 1 year later, Ada Deer was born into the Menominee Tribe. She and her 4 siblings were raised on the Menominee Reservation in a one-room cabin with no plumbing or electricity. The tribe, like other tribes, continued to experience poverty. As Deer noted in her memoir, "My impoverished childhood convinced me that I did not want to be poor, and early on I decided that education was the way out." Deer prioritized her education, graduating with a degree in social work in 1957 and a master's of social work in 1961. Almost 20 years after the Indian Reorganization Act was passed, a bill for termination, which ended federal recognition of tribes and tribal sovereignty, was introduced by Senator Arthur Watkins. Students will contemplate Watkins' letter to the Mormon elders when he wrote, "It seems to me that the time has come for us to correct some of these mistakes and help the Indians become a white and delightsome people as the Book of Mormon prophesied they would become." However, Deer wrote in her memoir, "Termination sought to end federal supervision, dissolve reservations, and assimilate individual Indians into the American mainstream." The Termination Act stripped Native people of their ancestral lands, culture, and sovereignty. When the Menominee Reservation became Menominee County, Native leadership ended. Students will examine a report by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. The report concluded that termination caused terrible economic reverses, making Menominee County the state's poorest, with unemployment over 5 times the state average. White men took control of the forests, river, and profits. Many Menominee were forced to leave the reservation and lived in poverty in cities. Those who preferred to speak Menominee were deemed incompetent to vote about tribal business. White-led leadership rarely met on the reservation or acted in the tribe's interest. Students will contemplate whether the Menominee Tribe was neglected and whether the U.S. government failed to uphold its responsibilities under the treaty it signed. The tribe's main income source was its lumber mill. However, Menominee Vern Teller explained, "I repeatedly asked the mill for work hauling the logs. However, the forester, a white man, always contracted with other whites, and when he did hire me, he paid me less than them." Tribal resources were depleted, and tribal land was sold to white buyers, many of whom held strong prejudices against Native Americans. As Deere explained, "They seemed to think that we had dilapidated houses and no jobs by choice." Students will uncover that 17 years after the Menominee Tribe was terminated, Deere worked to change the laws that denied their rights. She co-founded DRUMS, Determination of Rights and Unity for Menominee Shareholders. Deere built alliances by writing letters, attending meetings, and joining peaceful protests such as the 220-mile march to the state capitol. These efforts were often portrayed negatively by the media. Students will question why DRUMS protesters were deemed outside agitators and communists. In addition, Native Americans were often misrepresented by the media. In this New York Times article, the authors explained regarding Menominee progress post-termination, "The history of the last decade hasn't been all bad. Most notably, there have been significant advances in educational opportunities available to Menominee youth." However, a 1966 county report shows Menominee student dropouts rose to nearly 50% after termination, contradicting the article, which was spreading false ideas about Native progress. Deere did not give up. She shared the bill DRUMS was drafting with Senator Ted Kennedy, and he supported it. Students will think historically when they analyze how Deere lobbied in Congress, testified before the Senate, and spoke with reporters about the Menominee. She carried copies of the book, subtitled "The Menominee Struggle to Save Their Land and People" by Deborah Shames, in her briefcase, using it to explain the tribe's struggle. The Restoration Act faced fierce opposition. Students will explore multiple perspectives by reading about the whites who owned reservation land. Their attorney, William Giese, argued, "I don't personally see where restoration is the answer. I think it's a cop-out for the white man. Someday, we're going to have to educate these people to the level where they can cope with these problems." In other words, Native Americans would only succeed by conforming to the cultural, political, and economic practices of the white man's solutions. However, 20 years after the Termination Act was passed, the Menominee Restoration Act of 1973 was passed. The tribe was once again federally recognized. This halted termination activities across the country. On December 22, 1973, President Richard Nixon signed the Menominee Restoration Act and said, "The signing of H.R. 10717 represents an important turning point in the history of the American Indian people. By restoring the Menominee Indian Tribe, the United States government has at last made a clear reversal of a policy which was wrong. the policy of forcibly terminating Indian tribal status. Students will discover that the Menominee Restoration Act not only reinstated the tribe's federal recognition, but also set a precedent that influenced the restoration of nearly all other tribes previously affected by termination policy. This textbook chapter tells the story of Ada Deer, a woman who stepped up when the United States government stepped back from its promise. She was a Menominee tribal member who didn't just witness injustice, she challenged it. This textbook includes critical history about our nation's story, including often neglected Native American history and minority leaders such as Ada Deer. It doesn't offer easy answers, but real evidence and historical truth so students can ask tough questions and think critically. Ada Deer is an unsung hero. She may not appear in textbooks, but she should. Her steady determination and courageous strategic leadership brought her tribe and tribes across the nation back from the brink of extinction. She didn't seek attention, she sought justice. Her story reminds us that history is shaped not just by the famous, but by ordinary people whose strength, sacrifice, and extraordinary efforts, though often overlooked, change our world.